science advice to in the multilateral system, emerging challenges and innovative solutions. I'm Otto Kotani, Vice President for Science and Technology Society at ISC, and we're truly honored to be a moderator of this important session. So the world is rapidly becoming more complex and uncertainty. Climate change, pandemic, natural disaster of all kinds around the world, demonstrating that we are at a tipping point for the sustainability of our planet, and that we have a responsibility to make right decision based on science evidence. Maybe right decision is a little bit too naive, but we should try our best to make a reasonable, trustful, better decision. And so we live in such a small world, and our challenges are not just local, but have immediate global impact on society and economy. So every country has its own interests, which may cause conflict of interest between countries. And also, although the problem we encounter needs an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach, but each discipline has its own interests and value. So we have to make some kind of platform to make collective knowledge and collective action. Well, in mathematics, it is a problem of optimization, but our world is just too complex to find a solution in mathematics. So how we scientists collaborate to harmonize the national or disciplinary interest to play a role for a better world. Science is a universal language to have a rational argument based on evidence. Therefore, scientific advice in multilateral systems should be seriously addressed. The session is organized by ISC. It was established in 2018 as a merger of INGSA and ISSC, and as a consequence, it covers all science, including social science and humanity. Its vision is to advance science as a public good, and its mission is to be the global voice of science. So it can serve a platform for a multilateral system. Peter Gluckman, as its president, will talk the role of ISC in multilateral system. We have a panelist, one from WHO and one from UNEP, both other example of organization working in multilateral system. We will also hear a perspective from Global South. And so unfortunately, Lajina Zerbo, former head of Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization and current chairman of Rwanda Atomic Energy Board, is not available to participate and send his apology not be here. So I would like to invite the panelists one by one. So Tania Kuhemura, Unit Head, Evidence to Policy and Impact, Research for Health, Science Division, World Health Organization, Building Capacity on Evidence-Informed Policy for Public Health. Please come. Yeah. No, just sit down. Okay. And Andrea Hinwood, Chief Scientist of UN Environmental Programs, Science for Anticipation. Please come. And Terence Forrester, Chief Scientist for University of West Indies and Professor of Experimental Medicine, Faculty of Medical Science, University of West Indies, Jamaica, and the Chair of ISC Fellowship Council. And finally, Peter Gluckman, I'm very honored to invite you and the President of International Council on Science and Action in Multilateral System and role that ISC is playing. Also, he is a founder of INGSA. So in this session, we are going to talk about, discuss about the multilateral system, its challenge and its opportunity, and how we harmonize the international interests and national interests and things like that. So we organized this session that first each panelist give 8 minutes presentation. And after that, I ask the question by one, and we discuss among the panelists. And afterward, we invite question and comment from the floor. That's what we plan. So maybe Tania, you can start your presentation. And she's going to use a slide. And so panelists cannot see your slide. So maybe I suggest the panelists to move the front chair. Well, of course you can stay here, but you cannot see her. So please show her slide. Technical.
It's up already. Yeah.
Oh, so.
Thank you very much, Motoko, for this kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure being here at INGSA2024 and to be contributing to the session that the International Science Council is organizing on scientific advice in the multilateral system. Before I get started and present on how WHO is building capacity at country level at the policy, at the science policy interface, I just wanted to take a second and also briefly speak about WHO itself, because WHO, in fact, has a long-standing commitment to the use of evidence. As you can see on this first slide here, and maybe some of you want to come a little closer because I do acknowledge it's a little short, it's little in terms of the vision that you have. But what you see on this slide is that already in WHO's constitution, so when the organization was founded in 1948, it was made clear that knowledge is essential in view of achieving the organization's mission. Another comparative advantage that we have in the area of health is that in the 1980s there was the evidence-based medicine movement, which became very strong, and then soon thereafter also expanded beyond clinical health into the area of public health, health systems, and also evidence-informed policy. And the kind of mindset, but also the use of evidence, the capacities, that's something that we are capitalizing on now and building on. So then in the early 2000s, the voices of member states became much stronger in view of WHO and the world, in fact, needing to bring the world of evidence and policy closer together. And on this slide, you see the World Health Assembly in 2005, where member states requested WHO to put in place an innovative mechanism bridging the gap between evidence and policy. And so WHO's response at the time was establishing a network, like INGSA, a network, called the Evidence-Informed Policy Network, operating at global, regional, and country levels. And that still exists. It's still very much WHO's key initiative in view of promoting evidence-informed decision-making at country level. Briefly, what is EVIPNet about? So it's a network that looks at promoting the systematic and transparent use of evidence in decision-making. It's about capacity building, so it's not WHO as a global organization aiming to undertake knowledge translation for countries, but it's really about putting countries into the driving seat and increasing ownership in this space. But going beyond capacity building and looking at institutionalization, so sustaining the efforts and either strengthening or creating, depending on the local circumstances, what we call knowledge translation platforms. In INGSA speech, it's maybe rather saying advisory systems, so supporting countries, strengthening these or putting them in place. We're operational in more than 50 countries, and as it is a network, we're really trying to look at increasing horizontal and vertical lines of communication, meaning vertical lines, global, regional, and country level, and horizontal, meaning that the countries are exchanging experiences, good practices, lessons learned, to really create a platform of learning and of collaboration. On this slide, many of you will be familiar with the key approaches of knowledge translation, of bringing evidence into policy. What I would in particular like to point out is that frequently we look at the more linear approaches of push efforts and pull efforts. There have also been sessions here at the conference. These are very important, but we have to complement them, right? We have to also look at the linkages and exchange, building relationships throughout the research generation process, whether at certain points of time when the research question is being formulated or throughout the entire generation process. So next to linear approaches, we need the relationship approaches, and then for EVIPNet, really important are the integrated efforts, meaning systemic approaches, where we bring the 3 different approaches together in an institutional manner in the form of the knowledge translation platforms that I've mentioned. I also wanted to point out, and that's what you see on the right-hand side, the EVIPNet call for action. So while EVIPNet as such is already nearly 2 decades old, member states have reconfirmed their commitment to the network and to the need for the network to continue operating during the pandemic and building on the lessons learned of the pandemic. And on this slide, you see 4 different strategic domains that the call for action encourages countries beyond the network, in fact, to join in terms of implementation plan and also resources. And it's all about the first, it's a little small for you, but it's about institutionalization again, making sure that there are standards, norms that allow for credible products and knowledge translation processes to be implemented that are trusted by decision makers. Thirdly, it's about the capacity building, and that we mean beyond individual skills, but as I mentioned earlier, institutional capacity. And then the last point is about allowing for better access to the evidence. So developing global goods that are policy relevant, but also making them easily accessible and user-friendly. So these are the 4 strategic domains. Now, I've been talking quite a bit about institutionalization, and that is because the session also asked us to look at challenges. Institutionalization is, we believe, a challenge that we are encountering. Member states have asked us for quite a while that they needed guidance in this area, and why we initially thought the infrastructure is most important. We wanted to dig into it a little bit more and understand how can we, what is institutionalization, what is the definition, and how can we provide better support to member states. And so we undertook a critical interpretive synthesis, developed 2 frameworks, and then building on them a new guide, a checklist that was published last year. With the result that we now have a definition of institutionalization, which very much points out to the fact that institutionalization is not just an outcome, but in fact it's a process. It's moving forward in an iterative manner to allow for the recreation, maintaining, and reinforcement of norms, regulation, and standard practices, and that are embedded in values, and that the actions become legitimate and also basically taken for granted, so as a routine process that is institutionalized at country level. So that would be the definition that we have, but just as important, in the checklist we have a systematized process how a country can proceed if they're interested in institutionalization, meaning first of all an assessment of the landscape of the evidence ecosystem. Secondly, then in the guide you will see an explanation of the 2 different domains frameworks, and then thirdly, how countries can take that forward in engagement, stakeholders, in developing a journey of institutionalization. So as I said, there are 2 different frameworks that we embed in this publication. Maybe I just point out here one important learning for us is again that while we talk a lot about infrastructure and about advisory systems, that's one key element. We call it governance. So those are the steering functions in the evidence ecosystem. But other areas such as partnerships, such as making sure that there's leadership, not just for change processes, but for maintenance, that these are crucial. So the document outlines the 6 different domains that are the pillars of institutionalization, and secondly, walks countries through the different steps of the institutionalization framework, and countries can then assess at which level of maturity they are. And the guide also outlines what kind of activities, depending on the level of maturity, the country might want to engage and advance in. Again, it's very contextualized. You need to have the situation analysis first and then also the stakeholder engagement. But this is what we are currently piloting in a few countries worldwide. It has been applied already in a few informal settings, and academia has much to work with this as well. So please watch the space. I think this is hugely interesting for us to give better guidance to member states in this particular area. Another key challenge, and this is my last slide, is with regard to our community, global evidence to policy community. I think we need to further walk the talk in what we're doing. So understanding and underpinning our own activities with additional evidence. And so the map that you see here was developed with PACE, the Pan-Africa Collective for Evidence, where we're looking at the available evidence on the arts and science of using evidence in decision making. The map was developed in using search strategies encompassing all 6 UN languages. More than 50,000 papers were screened. It contains more than 600 studies and should be available within the next month. So if you're interested in that, I think this is going to be a huge added value to our work globally, regional and at country level to understand and to be able to pick what works in this particular field. Building on this evidence map, which is at the same time an evidence gap map, we are at the moment developing a global research agenda on evidence-informed policy making and knowledge translation, which is not only focusing on health, but is multi-sectoral and will hopefully also provide additional guidance to funders in this space so that efforts can be coordinated better, that there's less duplication, and that we become more cost-effective in many ways when it comes to the particular area of research on research use. So with that, I will end. I've just summarized basically what I've been saying in a few key messages, but I understand I'm running out of time, so I will leave it here. Thank you so much.
Maybe we go back to our original seat so that we can see the audience, and also audience can see our face. Okay, so next presenter is Andrea. So could you give 8 minutes presentation?
Is that on? Yes, it is. You know, it's always dangerous to put a microphone in front of me. I might hang on to it for longer than 8 minutes. So look, I thought it would be worth actually telling you a bit about how the science operates in UNEP. So first of all, UNEP is actually governed by the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is comprised of 193 countries. So basically the people we work for are all of the member states who make up that United Nations Assembly. But then we have a whole range of other entities. So we are secretariats for multilateral environmental agreements. We have a wide range of multilateral environmental agreements, everything from the Minamata Convention on Mercury, the Convention for Biological Diversity, Montreal Protocol, the Basel, Stockholm, Rotterdam Conventions, etc. So there are a broad array of these agreements that countries have come together to actually decide that environmental action should be taken on. Now, not all of them, but many of them have also science and technical committees that actually support those conventions to provide direct advice to parties to make decisions around those conventions to see how they're going. In addition to that, we also have some panels. So UNEP and WMO are the secretariat for the IPCC. IPBES is there. We are the secretariat for the International Resources Panel, and we also have the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. So as you can see, there are a lot of different entities, all of which are scientifically based and or have scientific advisor type panels. UNEP itself has the ability to keep the environment under review. So one of the roles that I have in the organisation is to alert the issue to emerging issues. So for my sins, my office produced the report One Atmosphere on solar radiation modification. Why? Because people were actually researching that area. There are significant environmental implications from the development of those technologies, and it was actually to provide advice to countries to say, here is what we know about these technologies at the moment. We don't think they're going to be deployed anytime soon, but these are things you need to be thinking about in terms of governance. And UNEP provides advice across 32 topic areas. So we publish around 200 publications a year. They're across a whole range of topics from finance to waste management. There's the different reports going about restoration, adaptation, etc. So there's a wide range of activities across a wide array of areas. And clearly UNEP has some expertise across those areas, but it's absolutely essential for us to partner and to actually make use of some of these panels and the technical advisory groups to the MEAs to actually bolster the evidence base. UNEP, for example, has a partnership with the International Science Council because we recognise across those 32 topics we do not have expertise. If we take the case of solar radiation modification, never did I dream that I would be talking about solar radiation modification from my research base, but clearly had to engage with experts in that area across the globe to actually develop some information on that. So we use a variety of means to actually gain the evidence base, and we also partner with our sister agencies. So we have a global foresight report in place which is being developed, and we've had some work, but we're also developing a horizon scan on dual use research. Why would we be working with WHO, FAO and WOHA on the life sciences and basically looking at biotechnology, gene manipulation, etc.? Because the environmental implications of those issues haven't been considered. So as a One Health approach, we're working across our sister agencies on specific activities. It's a huge enterprise, as you can imagine, and hence the need for partnership and engaging with different organisations. But I want to talk to you about some of the successful areas. And there are two in particular. We all hear the Montreal Protocol successful because countries got down and they phased out ozone depleting substances. But in my view, one of the reasons that's successful is that early on they established a science advisory panel to talk about the science of ozone depletion, but they also created technical and economic options committees, i.e. they brought together industry, NGOs and government across the sectors where ozone depleting substances were used, and they sat down together to actually work out how could they solve this problem together. And I think by doing that, that gave confidence to member states, and it is still one of the most successful multilateral environmental agreements. And those groups are still operating. They're providing capacity building and training in countries to identify now particularly the issues with refrigeration, the replacements for refrigeration, etc. And of course one of their areas that they're looking at is the science and the potential deployment of aerosols that could actually impact the stratosphere. So that's on their science agenda, which would then be considered. The other one that's really successful is actually the Stockholm Convention. So one of the very nice things for us is that we do see a decline of persistent organic pollutants in biological samples, in environmental samples across the globe. We've got a very nice data set. There's a nice warehouse there. They only deal with persistent organic pollutants, and as you're all aware, there are probably 16,000 chemicals that we would consider of concern that we don't have that level of information. So the next panel that's actually being developed is the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution, and they will be having their third meeting in Geneva next month. So all of these enable us to look at the science, but they're all quite siloed. So we still have this issue of integration and actually combining issues because pollution, waste affects biodiversity, impacts climate change. Climate change exacerbates the impacts of pollutants in the environment. So one of the things that I still believe we really need to do, and the science community needs to work better to do, is how we integrate that so that we can actually handle the range of issues and perhaps be considering some of those innovative solutions to these what seem like very difficult problems to solve from different angles. So the availability of data, information and knowledge is critical, from local up to global and then global back to local. So we are working on developing a federated hub where people can house their data, etc. And we're certainly going to be talking about how we might strengthen that at the country level. We do have common country analyses which have a whole range of environmental data to help decision making. And at the moment, this is where the science is really needed, and it is needed at the national level to enable countries to make really good decisions. But there's also a requirement for capacity building in terms of how we use that data, information and knowledge. So that's really a very quick run through on a lot of different issues, and I welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The health and the environment, maybe Terence as well. So the health and environment is a big issue, the global agenda. But here we often hear the some gap between global north and global south, who decide to whom. And so I would like to invite Terence to talk from this perspective.
Sure. Thank you very much, Motoko. I was hoping to have followed Peter, but it gives me an advantage. I can say some of the things I think he might say. I'd like to take this at two very different levels. One is global, using ISC as the global example, and the other one is very local, trying to moot the requirements to diagnose what might be wrong in the global south, globally perhaps, but certainly the global south, in a systematic way of engaging science with policy. So there are gaps, but there might be a way in which we can approach it in a pointed manner. So in order to do this science engagement, in a situation where multilateral engagement is uneven, and a situation where science and policy engagement is uneven, I think the ISC can play and does play a very important role. International Science Council has many roles, as Sir Peter will emphasize, and it already has started to engage the multilaterals. General Assembly of UN, Secretary General of UN, and direct agencies, for example, UNEP. It is delivering on science, and one of the ways in which it is unique is that its members, that is science academies, science unions, are what I call geolocated. So they don't exist in the stratosphere. Each academy exists in a country or in a couple of countries. And the importance of that for me is that the issue of customization, bringing a general global question down to where the rubber meets the road in a country, and therefore being able to nuance both the description and the choice of problem and how to approach it is one of the things that I think ISC is really very well poised to do. Something that I'm very privileged to be associated with within the ISC is something that's about 2 years old, which is the fellowship. Now, there are about 250 newish fellows. Oldest one is about 2 years old. And not 2 years old, they are. But their lives as fellows doesn't exceed 2 years. They are also really intensely geolocated. They live in countries that are balanced by geography, north and south, rich and poor. The fellowship is really balanced in respect of gender. The fellowship is balanced also in respect of the skill sets. So social sciences, natural sciences, science communication, science and policy, science and diplomacy. All of those are deliberately enriched in the fellowship. And so this is another very key resource that I think can be deployed to support our thrust to improve the systematic engagement of science with policy so that we can achieve this nebulous but necessary end of transforming our approach to sustainable development. I'd like to change gears and now come very local, that is local south. And I have this predilection for using very concrete examples to exemplify large problems. There is a variable capacity to engage multilaterals, especially in science, across the global south. It might exist in wealthier countries, but not to the extent. And I'm going to use the government of Jamaica, where I'm from, as an exemplar, and then generalize at the end. So within the government of Jamaica, which is made up of many ministries, there is, for the most part, fairly sophisticated capacity and ability and demonstrated work in interacting with multilaterals, whether it is the World Bank for economic or debt management issues, whether it is the IMF for same reasons, whether it's for the UN agencies. We do it fairly well. There is, however, the predilection for all our ministries to depend on in-house science. It's understandable why that is so. You need to have a cadre of in-house science for managing the business of the day. But what we do very badly is ventilating that science advice external to the ministries. So engaging universities, engaging other science bodies with their networks in a systematic way is something that we do very poorly. And therefore the science advice and the science policy nexus is, I think, in danger there of being incomplete and missing wide input. In terms of reporting, as Sir Jeremy mentioned this morning, it's really good if science advice reports to the highest office holder in the government. And in truth, in fact, in Jamaica, there is something called the National Commission on Science and Technology that reports directly to the Prime Minister. But the last time it was active was perhaps 10 years ago. And so again, there is a gap where there's a structure that's not functioning, and therefore the system of using science for policy and programs is thereby impaired. That's a national example in a small island developing state. But I dare say that if we were to look across the global south and did propose a systematic evaluation of how this ecosystem exists for science advice in support of policy and action, that we might see common threads and then be able to develop a program of interventions, not driven top down, but perhaps induced bottom up. And so that is perhaps all I'd like to say in my truncated 8 minutes, that there is a global approach that the ISC can make. It's customized based on its membership and its new fellowship. There are gaps in science policy and science action interface in developing countries, exemplified by a small island developing states. It is admittedly a general problem throughout the global south at least, and I'm proposing that perhaps we need to do a systematic drill down to characterize these gaps and see whether there is an efficient way of remedying them. So thank you.
Science advice to national level, and you are leading the science advice to the international community. And so please make some presentation.
The ISC, which was formed...
To push button to make a green light.
The ISC is a relatively new body formed in 2018, and its mission statement said it's to be the global voice for science. But you don't have a voice if there's nobody there to listen to it. And so a major focus of the ISC has to be building a way to be the bridge between the active scientific community, the voice of that community, with the people who should be listening, primarily the multilateral system. So I'm going to focus on that interaction in my few minutes. But I think right at the outset it's really important to understand that there are fundamental differences between the evidence to policy interface at a national government level and that at the international level. At the national government level, you're dealing with the executive of government who have the capacity to make decisions, and that the interaction between the science advisory mechanism, the scientist and the policy maker, is towards making a decision, making a choice between different options that are there. There's a direct interface between the executive power and the science system when science advice is operating effectively. But in reality, the multilateral system has very little executive power on most issues, except when there are very technical agencies and there are very specific issues, some of which Andrea has alluded to and Tanya has. But they're ultimately at the mercy of member states in their decision making. And this has fundamental implications for how science advice should be framed in dealing with the multilateral system. The second point to make is the multilateral system is not monolithic. It's extraordinarily complicated. It's complicated within the UN system itself, which I'll come to, but there are other bodies. There's OECD and the Global Science Forum. There's regional bodies such as the AU. There are the regional development banks. There are the World Bank. It's a very complex system. And also, rather than dissect it all out, all of which are part of the interface that does need to be developed, I'm going to focus on the UN system. But as I've said, it's not monolithic. We need to think about the central elements, that is the General Assembly, the New York apparatus, the Secretary General's office, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and the role of member states. And I'm going to say a lot about that in a moment, not all of it good. And then there are the agencies with policy and technical arms such as UNEP, WHO, UNESCO. These can have the very influential role, as has been pointed out by Andrea, of the executive boards and their general assemblies, but they also have a deep experience of both using internal scientific and external scientific expertise. And I have to say, in recent years, there's been a growth in the ability of these agencies to work externally as well as internally. And then there are some very technical agencies in the UN system, like the World Meteorological Organization, United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, and the related instruments like the Convention on Biological Warfare, etc., etc. And then there are some very autonomous components, like UNDP and UNICEF, which operate without the oversight of member states in the way that other components do. Obviously, the more technical agencies tend to have very internally robust science and technical mechanisms and their own networks, but we're actually finding increasingly they're also turning to the International Science Council for two reasons. One is the ISC has the capacity to quickly find the plurality of disciplines across the social sciences as well as the natural sciences, which may not have been traditionally available to the technical agencies. And secondly, we can reach out to balance global north, south, east, west in doing so very rapidly. And we now find ourselves increasingly in that brokerage role of identifying groups of experts to help the technical agencies on specific issues where they need help, sometimes at relatively short notice. The ISC has a number of rather deep relationships. The United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction, where Anne-Sophie here has led a lot of the technical work on classifications of hazards and so forth, and it's a very long-standing relationship related to the operationalization of the Sendai framework and so forth, which is basically a scientific agreement. There's the World Meteorological Organization, where we partner on looking after the World Climate Research Program. The growing relationship with UNEP, which is a very important relationship, and I think that it's become a very constructive mutual relationship. We both understand relative roles, but we can help each other in multiple ways, both formally and informally. With the United Nations Development Program, where we have done a lot of work for them on the revision of the Human Development Index, Human Development Report, and now we're working with them on the deeper issues of social cohesion and polarisation. And we're in an emergent relationship now with WHO, where we've been working with Tanya on some of the issues she's talked about, and more directly on specific issues where we can bring social science to bear alongside the natural sciences. One of the biggest issues we're finding is there's a goodwill often between the UN agency and ourselves, but UN agencies themselves are always short of money, and we're always short of money. And so finding the funding sometimes for what are identified as being useful things to bring together remains an ongoing challenge in this difficult world. I'm not going to spend time on UNESCO, because obviously the relationship with UNESCO is distinctive, because of course they represent the multilateral, the intergovernmental system with relationship to science. We represent the active scientific communities in relationship to science, and building that relationship, which has waxed and wanes over the years, is both complex and critically important. But let me, in the last 2 minutes or 3 minutes before Motoko shuts me up, or tries to shut me up, talk about the central political component, the New York apparatus, because I think there's some frank discussions there. Like in many poorly formed science advisory mechanisms in national governments, what you're seeing in New York is a competition of lots of players for access and competition for access to power. And so it's a very strange system, and we're very much like at the stage which existed in many countries where the formal processes are rather weak, and that leads to a lot of issues. Understanding the role of the different elements in New York is not easy. Itself relies on the internal networks of individuals within the New York apparatus, as you see in many national government apparatuses as well. So let me just peel it apart. Traditionally, the major voice of science in New York has been what's called the Major Group on Science and Technology, which the ISC and the World Federation of Engineering organisations are the co-chairs of. Frankly, it's tokenistic and puts science on the same level as farmers, workers and unions, which does not see science as core to multilateral system policy formation. It's responsible and it has some influence, but on what I think themselves are very weak processes, which is the so-called STI forum and the high-level political forum processes, which were meant to bring science and technology into the sustainability agenda, but quite frankly, I think they are window dressing on the core issues of how you actually bring science to bear on these challenges. They just support talk fests, not action. The ISC decided to put an office into New York, and so our second base beyond Paris is now in New York, and it's starting to work very effectively. And the reason for that is the section of these four elements in New York is quite complex. The most important and the most difficult is DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which is the in-house policy shop of the Secretary General's office. And like in-house policy shops domestically, they don't like external advice. They want to do it all. And so there's a tension between DESA, who controls much of the sustainability agenda, and they're somewhat jealous of other inputs. I'm being very frank here. I hope nobody's recording this. Secondly, there's the United Nations Secretary General's office. People think the Secretary General has a lot of power. He is at the mercy also of the member states in many ways. And he established a scientific advisory mechanism. There's a lot of debate about that mechanism. It's a combination of the UN agency chief scientists who already were meeting and had a good relationship with some, I'm going to say, almost randomly collected scientists who are not necessarily experts at the science policy interface. Its purpose is not entirely clear, but underneath that, they are now working with us to actually reach out for advice when we need it. I'm nearly finished. Thirdly, there's the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is much more important than people realise. It's not just its meetings, it's the way the member states work there. And so jointly with UNESCO, we established the group of friends to ensure that there is a direct relationship between science and the discussions that member states have. And finally, I want to make one last point. Because the member states ultimately have power in the UN system, particularly in New York, That means the diplomats of individual countries ultimately have the say and influence. And so if we want to change the influence of science in the UN system in New York, as opposed with the technical agencies, it needs strong scientific input into individual member states' foreign ministries. That's where the major difference in New York will appear. There remains very few foreign ministries that have structured scientific input into their decision-making process, and that becomes important. At the end of this year, or in September, there's the Summit of the Futures. One of the 5 pillars in the Pact is STI. But sadly, if you look at the detail in the Zero draft of the Pact, it sees STI largely in the framing of innovation, not in terms of the broader use of knowledge in policy formation. And I'd encourage all of you to get your member states to look at the Zero draft of the Pact and see how it can be reinforced so the proper role of science within international policy making is represented beyond what the goodwill of people like Andrea and their agencies are able to do.
Thank you, Peter. So now I would like to ask a question one by one. And so actually, I would like to spend more time for the limitation and opportunity of multilateral system. But before that, the first question is what is the special feature of the science advice in multilateral system, contrast to the science advice to the government on the national level? And Terence already touched upon that, but I would like to ask the Tanier and Andrea, especially to Tanier, is there any difference at the emergency, like a pandemic, recent pandemic, or the long-term decision making? So,
it's a very good and important question, whether there's any difference in peace times or in emergency situations when it comes to the evidence policy interface. In many ways, what we are promoting is that during peace times, we need to establish the processes and the infrastructure, because they don't really differ that much. The main difference is that during emergency situations, you have to be very quick. And you can only be very quick, or it's of an advantage, if you have the mechanisms in place, the relationships already, that trust already exists between those who provide evidence, those who need evidence, because in emergency situations, you don't have the time to do that. And we know in particular, not only structures and systems, but relationships, they need quite a lot of time to mature. So, maybe that is a kind of answer to your question.
Yeah, that's a kind of limitation and challenges for this kind of decision making. And so, Andrea?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on that, because what is interesting in the increasing frequency and intensity of events, climate volatility, etc., of course, we're seeing massive displacement and major issues right across the globe. And of course, things like wildfires, which in a country like Australia is just common garden, we're very used to them in the landscape. We're very well prepared. The international community is not. And what's really interesting with the work that we've done is that we're currently spending 99% on response and about 1% on prevention and preparedness. So at a global level, wouldn't it be great if we actually were able to say across the board, let's provide the tools for prevention and preparedness and switch the budgets around so you're actually preparing for it, not having to mop up after. Because what I can see at the moment is that that train has gone and you're seeing all of these events. So you're playing catch up all the time, and at some point we've got to try and get ahead. So for national governments, they need to get their responses sorted to specifics, because a global network can't do that. And so that's where the global could set the protocols and the frameworks, but then countries can actually then operationalise. So for me, I see the global arena in the environmental space as setting what the goals are, what the agenda should be, and what we're trying to achieve, and providing the evidence base to support that. And then at the national level is how it's relevant at a particular context.
Thank you very much. And those environmental issue is very difficult because it's not only science. Of course, it's based on science evidence, but also it is related with economy and the society, and also it is maybe already we go beyond the planetary boundary, but people cannot realize immediately, and so you are. Immediate life and also the future, so decision is very difficult to make, and so Terence, do you want to add some comment of national and international or the multilateral system?
Perhaps I'll pass this round if I might.
Okay, the limitation and opportunity in multilateral system is already discussed a little bit, and Peter will mention the the global vision, global viewpoint, and global principle, but executive is national level or local level, and action, and we don't. ISC do not have much funding, the resource, and so, but it is one of the limitation. And do you have any other comment?
Well, I think the point that was made just recently is important. We saw in COVID that countries needed two elements to be in place to be able to use science well. First of all, they need to have a mechanism already in place. Otherwise, there was competition for power and access to power. Secondly, they need to have people who understood the interface and were pre-prepared to deal with the emergency. And I think that is the core issue for any global emergency. At the end, every national government needs to have pre-prepared processes and people. Now, part of it, which I think may be important, is building up rosters of international experts who can help. I'm reminded of a story when we were having a chief scientist meeting of the Asia-Pacific region in Malaysia at a time when the Indonesian peat fires were burning very badly. And the Prime Minister came to us and said, how can you find us some expertise to help deal with this? And overnight, we recognised that nobody in that region had thought to talk to places which had a lot of expertise in managing peat fires, namely the Irish Fire Service, namely some of the people in places which not have been thought to be relevant. And we acted to be able to link a bridge between the people in Southeast Asia and the people who had really expertise. Now, I think as we think more and more, and this is where the work that UNEP has been doing with ISC is so important, identifying what we need to be prepared for into the future, we should also be thinking about the fact that for most countries, outside the biggest of the countries, the expertise that may be needed is not there. Finding pre-trained people who do understand the cultural diversity, the policy diversity in different places, who are able to give technical advice in a hurry, may be the kind of thing that we at the ISC, working with the UN system, need to make and develop. If you like, taking the SAGE mechanism from the UK and making it somewhat global, with people who are appropriately prepared to deal with the issues, because handling the issue in Jamaica will be very different to handling the issue in New Zealand, and therefore you have to have people that are conscious of that. I mean, it's no different to the fact when floods happen in the UK, they tend to reach out to the Dutch for expertise on how to manage them.
So ISC has a regional hub for the communication, and I think it's very important because international and national is a little bit too gap, but regional interest and regional problem can be integrated, and it makes a stronger voice to the international decision making. And so I think.
No, I agree, and I think that there's good examples. I think the way the Caribbean, and Terence may want to talk about the way the Caribbean Emergency Development Agency and some of the other things that the Caribbean Academy have done, the work that the Caribbean Academy did to force WHO and the UN to think more seriously about non-communicable disease, for example, is a way that regional bodies bringing the voice, particularly of smaller countries, to bear collectively has been very effective. I mean, in the global apparatus, the SIDS country collective may be the most influential of the groupings at the UN system.
Thank you, Peter. Just some disparate comments. One is that the Caribbean nations, very small, Barbados, 300,000 people, Jamaica, 3 million people, have, not quite sure why, honed this capacity to engage the multilateral system and to let their voices be heard. And so, yes, I take it that we have engaged properly. In terms of disaster response, one thing that crept to mind as we spoke was the differing abilities or capacities or success with different domains. So for infectious disease epidemics, whether it was Zika or chikungunya or COVID, the response was pretty good in terms of just dealing with the virus, with lockdowns and all the other things. And so mortality rates were very small. Economic impact after the pandemic was surprisingly mild in, say, Jamaica. So we've gone from a 10% inflation rate immediately after the epidemic right back down to 4% in 2 years. And that, again, just reflects the relationship between some countries and, say, the IMF and the World Bank. On the other hand, the response in terms of climate, and here, Andrea, I want to bring you out. Whereas we might be very familiar with health and responsive to health, as a region we seem not to be as prepared for climate. And perhaps it is our modeling, perhaps it is the information that we have and how we use information that might be less than game standard. So is this disparity between infectious disease treatment, something that we've known for thousands of years, versus climate change, which we are now aware of for decades, do you see this disparity widely? And what underlies it? Is it absence of modeling, absence of whatever?
What is it an absence of? So with climate change, increased frequency, intensity of events, I think because they're happening maybe once every 10 years instead of 100 years, there's still a gap in between. So, we're pretty good at forgetting what happened 10 years ago. We recover. But I think, and I also think, because we are geared economically to deal with response and not prevention, and I would argue we've been talking about a pandemic for 40 years, and we had some plans in place, and the public health system actually was well placed to handle it. Did we listen to our public health professionals? Not necessarily in terms of response. So they existed, and to some extent, but if you're the Arctic and the Antarctic and you're increasingly having fires where you've never had fires before, and you've got they're newer issues, so you need to start developing the expertise for those regions. So yes, we've been talking about those predictions, but I think until some things happen, people then don't say, okay, we've got to prepare for them. And I think that's where the global community can come in, because there is a lot of expertise in how you actually prepare and prevent. I mean, in conflict zones, I think one of the really interesting things, you'd say, why are you talking about a conflict zone and children's education? We know that these conflicts are occurring, we know where the vulnerabilities are, and we know there is a likelihood of flood and change in those areas. And what happens when all of those people are evacuated from those flood areas? The children lose their schools. So it's a no-brainer if you actually then start to look at the predictions in that particular area, work with the community, put in place adaptations so the community's resilience, but look at how you actually manage the community so those kids still get to have their education and don't miss it for years on end because you've got vulnerability. So again, to me, that's about how we link up our systems so that we can provide good advice that people can then use on the ground. And I think increasingly the reality is we have what we have now is what we have. It's only going to get worse. So let's actually start to prevent.
Thank you very much. Actually, I was going to ask about the human capacity building, and Tanya already touch upon this kind of human security and human capacity building. And so to make multilateral, the science advice in the multilateral system, we really make some kind of opportunities, and we can share what kind of opportunity we can make. And one of the things is foster the people. And so do you have any comment? Tanya, you already mentioned about that, but it's very important.
So I hope I understood the question correctly, Motoko, is about capacity building in
Yes,
on the evidence to policy interface. Well, I mean, the WHO is very much known as a standard setting normative organization. So a lot that the organization is doing is developing global guidelines in various areas, infectious diseases, non-communicable diseases. But then the question is how, and we heard that throughout the conference as well, how can we support countries to contextualize this global evidence, these global goods, because they are not going to be useful unless they really meet local conditions. And this is what we're aiming to do with our capacity building, so that we're not just operating at the global goods level, but at the same time that we are working with the countries, and this is very much the work that I'm doing, to support them in having the capacities, the individual capacities, but also the institutional capacities to take global goods, and that doesn't have to be a WHO guideline, that's depending on the policy question, various types of evidence that then meet the respective policy priority. So this kind of capacity building is what we do at country level through trainings, through technical assistance, through peer support, through the network, yeah.
Thank you. Peter?
I think one of the biggest challenges that comes out of the comments that have been made right along this line is a generic comment which applies both at national level and the multilateral level, which is getting pluralistic input. We saw in COVID that there was a rapid involvement just of the epidemiologists or the virologists, but the economists, the educationalists, the social scientists were well out of the loop. We've seen in climate change that all the focus has been on the physical sciences of climate change and not on the social and societal responses to it. And we're working at the ISC with UNESCO and others in the OECD on how do we improve evidence to policy interfaces which are pluralistic. In other words, where you need multiple agencies acting together, because governments are very siloed. UN agencies are very siloed. How you actually get across these silos to deal with these major issues is actually a fundamental issue in public policy making, and it's actually also an issue in science advice. So it's a challenge that we've been asked by UNESCO in particular, by Gabriel Ramos, the ADG there, through the work that we do with them, to think specifically on how to find new generic models to break down policy silos and evidentiary silos.
Thank you. And so I think one of the role of ISC is to make opportunity to train the researcher interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary way. That the because as you already mentioned in the plenary lecture, the funding for the transdisciplinary research is limited, and also research assessment and etc. So in each international science union can train the scientists in their disciplines. There is not too much opportunity for training the researcher to meet social needs. And also at INGSA, INGSA try to develop and foster the people who understand the science, both science and diplomacy, and we really need such kind of people. So this could be an opportunity the IC can provide.
It's a whole different conversation, Motoko, but I think that we've got to acknowledge that science itself needs to evolve. that we're still largely working with Mode 1 scientific models, and that remain important for discovery science in so many ways. But when you take science to action, which is where, for instance, the fact that where governments want to see science go, where the multilateral system needs to see science go, one needs increasingly transdisciplinary approaches where stakeholders are part of the scientific process right from the beginning. And the whole science system is not designed to support that mode 2 research, be it the way universities work, be it the way funders work, etc., etc., etc. So the ISC is working hard through a number of ways with Global Forum of Funders, so forth, to actually promote the need to find new mechanisms to support transdisciplinarity. And of course, ultimately, if transdisciplinary research becomes a more standard model of research, you'll see the policy makers involved in thinking about the research questions right at the outset, as well as the scientists, which should improve the interface. Now, it's easy to say in theory. In practice, there's a lot of actors that would need to agree if change is to occur, but it's a major theme of the work, and those of you who know about the ISC's work know that we're actually promoting some pilot work in that area at the present time.
Thank you. So maybe I would like to invite a question from, please tell your name and also ask question if you have a specific person.
Roger Pfister, Swiss Academies of Arts and Sciences. I have 3 questions, if you don't mind, to address to 2 people sitting on the panel. First 2 questions to Tanya. There was quite some criticism from different corners towards WHO that it couldn't or didn't play the role that it should have played, particularly at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. I'm wondering, what role did the EVIPNet play in that context? What was the exchange, in particular with China, of information at that level? How did that work at the practical level during those critical days at the beginning of the pandemic? These are the questions to you, and then the question to you, Peter. You mentioned a major science and technology group at the UN, and you, as I understood it, you said that it wasn't ideal that you're sort of at the same level as the organized farmers and organizations. I didn't quite understand why this isn't a disadvantage that you're at the same level as these other organizations. If you could maybe elaborate on that. But first, maybe ladies first. Thank you.
So to your questions, there are 2 questions, right? On the one hand, the role with China, and here I can very quickly say that China is not part of EVIPNet, so we have not directly worked with China during the pandemic. I think the major role that the network has played in this emergency situation was that through the capacity building, the members of the network were able to capitalize on that capacity. So, for example, quickly mobilizing evidence, synthesizing it, and putting it to decision makers in a context where in other countries, otherwise the evidence just would have not been able to so systematically been upraised, synthesized, and then brought forward. So basically getting back to what I've said earlier, that when one invests early on before a crisis hits, when systems are in place, when capacities are in place, then they can be used also to respond to a pandemic like COVID-19.
The major group is a somewhat archaic concept of just allowing clusters of interest groups to have a small voice in general assemblies and other fora at the UN, 2 minutes to make a comment or whatever. That's not the same of embedding science and technology at the heart of policy making and at the discussions in the UN system. It doesn't make them part of the processes that lead, which is why the Group of Friends was established. The Group of Friends, for those who don't know about Group of Friends, they're a formal part of the UN system. They're, if you like, lobby groups of member states who get together on a particular issue. They work if there's a secretariat that supports them. And so we work to establish a Group of Friends which is currently chaired by Belgium, India and South Africa. We originally wanted to call it the Group of Friends for Actionable Knowledge, but it was actually turned by them into the Group of Friends for Science for Action, which is subtly different. We in UNESCO act as co-chairs of it. It's still really finding its modus of operation, but the idea was to make sure that the actors who really, in the end, determine what happens in New York, which are the member states, have access directly to scientific input on the issues they're actually confronting. And it's still in early embryonic stages, but some groups of friends over the years at the New York have been very, very effective on things like small arms trade and other areas. They've been very in water issues and so forth. So for us, this is seen to be a way to have a direct interaction with the permanent representatives in New York rather than just through the bureaucracy of New York.
Okay, so please. Okay, one.
Jan Marco Müller. I work for the European Union, which is arguably the most sophisticated multilateral system there is, and I would argue even the most impactful one. And if you look at the 67 years of existence of the EU and its predecessor, the European Community, it has kind of grown and developed a science advisory ecosystem over time and experimented a lot with different kind of structures of science advice. And of course we have the Joint Research Center, which, as the name says, started as a research center and developed into a science and knowledge service, which does all the nitty-gritty technical support, checking the footnotes, looking that the standards are measurable, etc. And what few people know is actually JRC represents almost 10% of the Commission staff. It's a huge workload, huge staff number they have in comparison also to the rest. And then we have added to this various other elements. We experimented with the chief science advisor, replaced it with a science advisory mechanism, which has a group of chief science advisors doing advice to the political level, having a kind of a consortium of the academies that does all the evidence review reports, etc. And similar developments we had also on the side, for instance, of the European Parliament with technology options assessment, European Parliament Research Service, and so on. So it is quite actually an interesting example to look at in terms of what kind of elements work in such a setting. And what I just would encourage also the UN system and other multilateral organizations just to look at the examples and look if there are perhaps elements that also could be used in the other setting. I mean, Tanya mentioned, for instance, WHO's role in standard setting. I mean, most of EU policies is about standardization and harmonization, which boils down to very technical issues. So I think take perhaps a little bit of inspiration also there.
And I think there's a lot of evidence of copying elements of the bits that can be done, given, of course, the EU does grant more sovereignty from the member states to the EU than most multilateral regional organisations do. But let me pick up a few examples. Pacific Commission, which is based in Noumea, provides technical services in areas like fishing and other areas, ocean management, to 15, 20 Pacific Island states. The CDMA in the Caribbean provides the emergency response to information for all the Caribbean states. Australia and New Zealand have a whole lot of joint technical agencies. The Food Safety Agency for Australia and New Zealand is the same in regulatory of drugs. So again, countries which have been willing to sacrifice some level of sovereignty to shared services, there are models all around the place. The EU represents the most sophisticated. I think Australia and New Zealand are getting close in a number of areas because despite the fact that we're better at rugby and they're better at cricket, we do try and work somewhat together some of the time. But so I think that there are good examples, and I think that particularly for developing countries with lesser resources, the ability to share technical services and scientific services is very good. The differences in the EU is largely about regulation and standards, and for the bits that are referred to the EU from the member states. The issues here, however, there's no comparable arrangement anywhere else in the world to what the EU's achieved.
Tanya?
Yeah, just wanted to add, thank you so much for that intervention. And you have also heard earlier this morning Jeremy saying that one of the solutions, one of the areas that we want to and will be focusing on more is assessment of scientific advisory systems and case studies. So maybe we could talk with you afterwards whether the European Union or Commission could be, for us, one of the case studies to further look into. So,
next question.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nega from Ethiopia. So my question is directed to Andrea from UNEP. One of the global development processes for which we often hear dissatisfaction from different sections of society, including the public, the science community, even including the policymakers, is how the global climate governance system is going on. So when I think of these issues, the first institution to come to my mind is the IPCC, which is a boundary organization, of course, in a multilateral system. So in view of this dissatisfaction, how do you see the effectiveness of IPCC in informing as well as influencing the global climate governance system, including this UNFCCC processes, a conference of parties, and so on? Thank you.
That's a loaded question. I don't know I want to answer it. So IPCC is, effectively providing us with the science of what's happening and providing that information to all member states. And, their processes are rigorous, and really it is probably the most authoritative, voice that we have about what's happening with our climate. The UNFCCC and the agreements that have been set, and in particular the Paris targets, is where all the issues are. And that is a very difficult space because certain countries have agreed to particular targets, and at the moment they are still on track to meet those targets because they're still in the future, right? The issue that we are finding is that the actions that are being taken now are insufficient based on our modelling to actually meet those targets. So our recent foresight exercise has actually thrown up that there's an increase in fossil fuel subsidies. Well, you'd be thinking that actually that would be declining and that there would be a reduction there. So the actions that countries are taking are insufficient in terms of speed and nature with the current modelling to meet the targets. And that means that we have to do a lot more to actually convince governments with their short-term agenda that they need to be looking at the long-term, not the short-term. And there are lots of governments who've made some recent decisions that are not in the interests of the global climate. And I think IPCC is still there to, what do they call it, hold the feet to the fire, to say this is actually what's happening from a scientific point of view. I think the issue that we have is that countries are making decisions that are not in their long-term interests. They're looking at their short-term interests.
I think that's and Jeremy raised it in his comments earlier today. I think, and in fact, if we go back to the other aspects of emergency preparedness and resilience enhancement, the fundamental problem of the moment is the externalities of populism, of social media, of everything else drive governments to think short-term rather than long-term. And we haven't worked through an effective way of shifting the whole society to demand long-termism versus short-termism. And there are reasons for that caught up in evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology. It's easy to say that we should all think long-term, but in fact our brains are designed to largely think short-term. And so how we change the narrative to think long-term is actually turns out to be a much harder issue in managing group psychology than most people realise. It's easy to state the problem, the solution is not clear.
So I see several hands, but I would like to take the question which is related with the discussion and then come back to another question. So is there, your question is related with what we discussed now? Okay, so please.
Thank you so much. I'm Mulshag Michael Obndele from the Nigerian Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And what we do is to act as the national coordinating platform for IP-based in Nigeria. So, science advice on multilateral environmental systems is of keen interest to me, and since yesterday I've been bordering on contextualizing science advice in the multilateral environmental systems. Either we like it or not, the global environmental crisis, be it climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, are key fundamental crisis to our human survival, in recent days. And in that sense, governments across the globe are going into international treaties. Now we just have a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and there is also another one in process, the International Plastic Treaty, and interestingly is being coordinated by the UNEP Secretariat. And also there is also an international treaty on the way on the chemicals and waste. Then as INGSA, I've also been thinking, how do we begin to contextualize science advice? What is the quality of evidence, research-based evidence that is being put on the table, in the process, in the global negotiation processes that leads to the formation of this international treaty? And on the other side, which I think should be of more interest to UNEP, International Science Council, and as INGSA, is the conscience of the developing countries. As a person, I participated throughout the process of the post-2020 global diversity framework, and the experience was very there. The whole burden on developing countries was very obvious. We have a lot of questions to begin to put to the table and decide how do we begin to create a process, to answer these questions. Most importantly, on strengthening the capacity and building institutional frameworks. There is no amount of individual trainings as professionals or researchers or as scientists. The question of institutional building is important. How does UNEP and the International Science Council now, perhaps through a collaboration, begin to put in place a framework that build the institutional capacity building for developing countries?
Thank you
so
for the
much.
comment. Maybe at the closing remark, your question will be responded. So maybe I take one more, and so let the lady.
Hi, I cannot explain how difficult it is to raise my hand as a young woman and non-native English speaker, but thank you so much for this very interesting panel. My name is Maria Jarquín. I am from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, home to over 500 environmental scientists, many of them working under the One Health approach. I wanted to ask Andrea, as a chief scientist, what science advice opportunities do you envision for the future in environmental assessments in conflict zones, an experience that we have at our research institute, and what key science policy interfaces should our research institutes tap in to provide our expertise and data? Thank you.
So the secretary said that we should close this session in 5 minutes. So I would like to the panelists to make a final comment, maybe responding to the question posed to you. So Terence, you can make the comment. Very short.
Final comment is really to amplify something Peter said about pretty much the same generic problem in multilaterals in terms of siloed arrangements where there's not enough lateral movement to really do coherent and systematic science policy advice. It's the same architecture at many national levels, and so perhaps there needs to be a joined up process as we solve that.
Tanya?
So my closing remark would, I guess, be related to the topic that international organizations have an important catalytic role both within the organization, so we need to make sure that in-house we have the capacity, like the 10% that the GRC European Commission staff has working on this particular area of work is, I think, amazing. So something where we look internally within the organization that we improve our processes and make sure that they are standardized and up to speed, but in particular also that we do not forget the outside world, and that again we have this catalytic role in promoting evidence to policy globally, regional and at country level.
So I just want to address 2 quick points. There's a lot of discussion about how we provide additional capacity in developing countries to actually be able to feed into the multilateral system. So I think that is an area of endeavour that we actually must pay attention to, and where we both access the science in developing countries, but also contribution to the different areas. So I was glad that you contributed to the CBD. Plastics is another issue. Just quickly, in terms of advice in conflict zones, this is going to be an area that we think will increase dramatically because the nature of conflict is changing and the environmental issues are also changing with them. So we need to develop a lot more of the remote tools to actually assess the environmental impacts, which we are doing, and then also how you actually consider the biggest issue is recovery and green recovery for particular locations. So there are opportunities in the global system. We work across agencies to do that.
At the end of the day, most decisions of the world are made at the level of national governments, and therefore one needs, even if the multinational system is providing advice and conclusions, the responses are largely at the level of the national government, even if they're relying on donor nations to provide the resources or foundations. And therefore, at the heart of this is every country, whatever its state of development, needs a process for knowledge brokerage and evidence synthesis within its system and expertise at doing that. Sometimes that can be shared. That's what we're trying to work with the small Pacific Island community at the present time that we're doing. The multilateral system needs to improve its act, but improving the act at the multilateral system will fail if it's not also thinking about the equipment and apparatus that's needed in every country, whether it's as small as Nauru or as large as India. We need to think in terms of the range of capacities that must exist if decision makers who have executive authority are to be able to act. There are then some big challenges ahead which will need global consideration, and how they're given global consideration is a giant issue. Whether if it's the next pandemic, what can we do better? We're still struggling to get a new pandemic treaty, new international health regulations in place because of the issues of national interests. What if the world needed a geoengineering solution? How would we even decide to do it? There are giant issues ahead that do need to think a lot more about the multilateral system, but the multilateral system at the end of the day is the sum of national systems. And that's why I'm giving an emphasis. We can act at the ISC to be the interface between the active scientific community and the multilateral system, but it needs much stronger national systems as well.
So thank you very much. So everybody agree that the multilateral system gets more and more important than ever, and I hope today's discussion will help this multilateral system to strengthen the national level, because almost all the action is taken in national level. Anyway, so thank you very much for the inspiring discussion to the panelists and also the audience. Thank you very much.